The night air in New Orleans feels different, thick with music, memory, and something unspoken. In a small club off Claiborne Avenue, a man once sat behind a piano and played like he was having a quiet conversation with the city itself. He never shouted for attention, never chased the spotlight, yet every note he touched shaped the rhythm of American soul. How does someone who defined the sound of a city remain almost invisible to the world? His name was Allen Toussaint, a composer, producer, and quiet genius who turned everyday life in New Orleans into melody. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea. Sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the lights of Bourbon Street, before the sound of brass bands echoed through the night, there was just a boy sitting at an old upright piano in a small house in Gert Town, New Orleans. His name was Allen Toussaint, and long before the world knew him, music already knew his heart. He was born on the 14th of January 1938 to Clarence and Naomi Toussaint, a working-class family that believed in two things: hard work and rhythm. Their modest home stood near the hum of streetcars and church bells, where every block carried a melody. In that neighborhood, sound wasn't just background noise, it was survival, it was joy, it was how people spoke when words failed. Allen's mother, Naomi, loved the radio. She filled the house with the voices of Louis Jordan, Ray Charles, and Professor Longhair, the man whose rolling piano style would become Allen's lifelong compass. His father worked long hours at a railway yard, but even he couldn't resist tapping his feet when his son played. The piano was second-hand, missing a few keys, but Allen didn't care. What mattered was the feeling. By the age of 7, he was already playing by ear, teaching himself chords he heard on the radio. He didn't know how to read music yet, but he understood its language instinctively. Every afternoon, as the humid Louisiana air pressed against the windows, Allen sat at the piano, turning childhood curiosity into something pure and powerful. New Orleans in those years was a city divided by color but united by sound. The segregation laws could separate schools, restaurants, and neighborhoods, but not rhythm. Gospel spilled out of churches, blues bled through bar doors, and jazz danced down the streets like an old friend. For a young boy like Toussaint, that soundscape was both classroom and church. When he joined a local teenage group called the Flamingos, he was shy, quiet, and unassuming. But when his fingers touched the keys, everything changed. One of his bandmates, the bluesman Snooks Eaglin, often said that Toussaint made the piano talk. It wasn't about speed or flash, it was about conversation, about knowing when to let a note breathe. His break came when fate intervened. One night, Huey Piano Smith couldn't make a show. The band needed a stand-in, and a teenage Toussaint stepped up. He played with such grace and command that people stopped dancing just to watch. That night, someone in the crowd noticed legendary bandleader and producer Dave Bartholomew, the same man who helped Fats Domino rise to fame. Bartholomew approached Toussaint after the set and asked him to come play in his sessions. That single moment changed everything. Soon, Allen found himself behind the piano at J&M Studios, a sacred place for New Orleans rhythm and blues. The sessions were long, the pay was small, but to Toussaint, it felt like stepping into heaven. He backed up artists like Smiley Lewis and Fats Domino when the main players couldn't make it. Nobody in the room could have guessed that the quiet young pianist sitting in the corner would one day become the architect of the city's entire sound. In 1958, under the alias Toussaint, he released his first instrumental album, The Wild Sound of New Orleans. It was filled with humor, groove, and the playful energy of a city that refused to stand still. The track, Java, one of his originals, hinted at the songwriter he would become clever, melodic, and timeless. He was still just a kid from Gert Town, but the pulse of New Orleans already flowed through his veins. Every gig, every studio session, every late-night jam on Claiborne Avenue added another layer to his craft. By the time he turned 20, Allen Toussaint wasn't just playing music, he was building a bridge between generations, between church pews and jukeboxes, between the sacred and the everyday. He once said that music in New Orleans isn't something you choose, it chooses you. And by then, it had chosen him completely. As the 1960 calendar turned, the young man who once practiced on a broken piano was now being called by record labels to shape their sound. The city had found its new voice, and it came from the quiet hands of Allen Toussaint. By 1960, Allen Toussaint had quietly become the most important young man in New Orleans music, though hardly anyone outside the city knew his name. He wasn't the singer, and he wasn't the star. But behind the studio glass, he was building something larger, the future sound of American rhythm and blues. When producer Joe Banashak founded Minute Records, Toussaint joined as the label's creative engine. He wrote, arranged, and produced often all in one night. The studio was small, just a few rooms packed with microphones, cigarette smoke, and the steady click of a metronome. But inside those walls, something magical happened. Toussaint's piano was both conductor and compass, guiding every session toward that unmistakable New Orleans groove. In 1960, Jesse Hill's Ooh Poo Pa Doo hit the airwaves, a playful chant built on Toussaint's arrangement. The record exploded, and the city's nightlife pulsed with it. Suddenly, people began asking, "Who's making all these hits?" The answer was simple: the quiet man in the back, Allen Toussaint. Then came Mother-in-Law, sung by the mischievous Ernie K. Toussaint wrote and produced the track in one inspired rush, mixing humor, gospel-style call and response, and that syncopated rhythm only New Orleans musicians could play. The song climbed to #1 on both the R&B and pop charts, a rare crossover at the time. With that single, Toussaint proved he could turn neighborhood stories into national anthems. Success followed quickly. He produced Benny Spellman's Fortune Teller and Lipstick Traces, both of which would be covered for decades by rock and pop bands around the world. He helped Chris Kenner record Land of 1,000 Dances, a song that began as a local jam and became a timeless standard. With Lee Dorsey, he created Ya Ya, another joyful, dance floor classic that carried the pulse of the Crescent City straight to radios nationwide. And yet, even as the hits piled up, Toussaint stayed humble. He rarely sought credit, often letting others take the spotlight. When asked why, he once said, "It's about the song, not the singer, not the man who wrote it. The song is what lives." Under the pseudonym Naomi Neville, his mother's maiden name Toussaint continued to write quietly, almost anonymously. To him, the music's success was enough. The alias was a small act of gratitude to the woman who had filled his childhood with rhythm and grace. But beyond the record sales, something deeper was happening. The sound Toussaint created, that blend of gospel soul, street funk, and polished pop, was reshaping the identity of New Orleans itself. He gave the city a musical language that could travel anywhere, elegant, earthy, and undeniably alive. By the end of 1962, Allen Toussaint was no longer just a local producer. He was the silent architect of a revolution, one that would soon echo far beyond Louisiana. And as the decade unfolded, he was only getting started. In 1963, just as his name began to circulate beyond New Orleans, Allen Toussaint's rhythm was interrupted by a letter from the U.S. Army. The draft pulled him away from studios and stages, away from the sound he had worked so hard to define. For 2 years, he served quietly, no spotlight, no audience, just discipline and time to think. Yet even then, melodies kept visiting him like old friends. During short leaves, he recorded with his backing band, the Stokes. One of their songs, Whipped Cream, would later be turned into a nationwide instrumental hit by Herb Alpert in 1965. Toussaint's music, it seemed, never needed him to be present to make an impact. It carried its own life. When he returned home to New Orleans after his service, the world had changed. The British invasion had arrived, soul was crossing into pop, and R&B was shifting in ways that didn't always favor Southern musicians. But Toussaint was not discouraged. If the music was changing, he would change with it, not by chasing trends, but by expanding the spirit of his own city. In 1965, he partnered with Marshall Sehorn to form Sansu Enterprises, a production company and label that would become the creative center of New Orleans soul. Their mission was simple: record local talent, keep the roots alive, and let the rhythm speak for itself. Within a few short years, Sansu became the heartbeat of the region, home to artists like Betty Harris, Chris Kenner, and Lou Johnson. But the company's crown jewel was Lee Dorsey, the easygoing singer whose smooth voice perfectly matched Toussaint's playful compositions. Together, they created songs that sounded like work and laughter rolled into one: Ride Your Pony, Get Out of My Life, Woman, and working in the coal mine. Each track told the story of everyday people with wit, rhythm, and compassion. Toussaint's piano glided between horn blasts and backbeats like a voice of reason amid chaos. He was painting portraits of working-class life without ever picking up a brush. But Toussaint's genius wasn't limited to writing songs. He was building an ecosystem, a musical community that could sustain itself. To do that, he gathered a group of young session musicians in 1966 to serve as Sansu's house band. They called themselves the Meters, and together they would go on to redefine funk. Tsigabu Modelista on drums, George Porter Jr. on bass, Leo Nocentelli on guitar, and Art Neville on keys, four men who would later be recognized as one of the tightest rhythm sections in history. Under Toussaint's direction, they backed nearly every artist who came through Sansu's doors. And when they began releasing their own songs, something electric happened. Tracks like Sissy Strut and Sophisticated Sissy pulsed with raw, syncopated energy, proof that Toussaint had helped create not just hits, but an entire movement. By the end of the decade, his sound had become the DNA of New Orleans funk. Sharp, intelligent, and irresistibly human. Record companies across America wanted to capture it, but few could. It wasn't just a rhythm, it was a feeling born from a city that refused to stand still. Toussaint, still humble, rarely took credit. He let others shine while he stayed in the shadows, content with the quiet satisfaction of creation. "When a song works," he once said, "you don't need to explain it, you just let it live," and live it did. The records he made in those years carried New Orleans far beyond Louisiana, across the airwaves of America and into the hearts of anyone who ever needed a little rhythm to keep going. By 1970, Allen Toussaint wasn't just making music anymore, he was shaping the soul of a nation. His turning point had arrived, not through fame or fortune, but through faith in sound, and the belief that the right song could make the world feel a little lighter. By 1970, the quiet man from Gert Town had become the sound of New Orleans. Allen Toussaint wasn't chasing fame. Fame came looking for him. His songs were everywhere. His arrangements echoed through radios from Louisiana to London, and his name carried the weight of authenticity. Yet, he still spoke softly, still introduced himself humbly, as if he were just another piano player passing through town. That year, he released his self-titled album, Toussaint, a record that distilled everything he had learned, elegant melodies, clever lyrics, and grooves that swayed like the streets he grew up on. Critics loved it, musicians studied it, and fans felt it. There was something in the way he wrote, gentle but powerful, like a breeze that could move buildings. Soon after, he signed with Warner Brothers and recorded Life, Love, and Faith. The album wasn't designed for the charts. It was a reflection of a man comfortable with who he had become. It carried gospel warmth, funk precision, and a deep understanding of the human heart. Toussaint didn't just make music, he made meaning. Around the same time, he and Marshall Sehorn opened the Toussaint recording studio on Clematis Avenue, a state-of-the-art haven for creativity. For New Orleans musicians, it was more than a studio. It was a sanctuary. The space quickly became the meeting point between the old and new worlds of rhythm and soul. Here, jazz brushed shoulders with funk, gospel harmonies met electric guitars, and Toussaint was always in the center, not as a star, but as a guide. Everyone came to Toussaint. Dr. John, the Meters, LaBelle, Paul McCartney, and Wings, even the Rolling Stones. They all wanted the Toussaint touch, that perfect balance of sophistication and swing. He arranged horns that sounded like sunlight breaking through clouds and pianos that made the floorboards hum. In 1973, Toussaint's partnership with Dr. John produced Right Place, Wrong Time, a funky masterpiece that reached the top 10. 2 years later, he helped Patti LaBelle and her group LaBelle craft Lady Marmalade, a track that would become a global phenomenon. Behind the glitter and glamour, Toussaint's fingerprints were all over it, from the horn stabs to the pulsing rhythm that made it unforgettable. But his finest hour as a solo artist arrived in 1975 with Southern Nights. It was his most personal record, a musical memory of childhood evenings in Louisiana, of family, laughter, and the gentle hum of the South. The title song was tender, dreamlike, almost spiritual. When country star Glenn Campbell later covered it, the song soared to #1. bringing Toussaint's music to audiences who had never even heard his name. He didn't mind. The success, he said, belonged to the song itself. At that moment, Allen Toussaint stood at the peak of his creative power. Toussaint was thriving, his influence spanned genres, and his melodies carried the heartbeat of an entire city. And yet, even in the middle of that triumph, he remained what he had always been: humble, precise, and deeply human. The spotlight had found him, but he still preferred to stand just outside its circle, letting the light fall on the music instead. Success, for Allen Toussaint, never looked like excess. While others wore fame like a crown, he treated it like a borrowed coat, something you use, not something you keep. Even at the height of his career, when Toussaint's studio was overflowing with artists and hits, he still arrived early, quietly poured his coffee, and started arranging horns before the sun came up. The world saw a genius, but he saw work to be done. By the late 1970 period, New Orleans had become a magnet for stars. Toussaint was no longer just a local studio. It was a pilgrimage site for anyone searching for soul. The Rolling Stones came looking for that raw southern edge. Paul McCartney recorded there, drawn to the warmth and looseness that no London studio could replicate. And through it all, Toussaint remained still calm, courteous, focused the quiet current beneath the noise. Yet, within that calm, small cracks began to show. The pressure to deliver constant hits was relentless. The music industry, once personal and communal, was turning into a machine, and Toussaint wasn't built for machines. He believed in craft, not commerce. For every artist who thanked him publicly, there were executives who overlooked him in boardrooms. He was praised in liner notes, but rarely invited to the spotlight. Interviews were scarce, awards delayed. Even as others profited from his sound, he stayed gracious. "I'm happy," he once said, "just to know the music found a home." It was a beautiful sentiment and perhaps a lonely one. Then came Motion in 1978, a record that marked both a daring evolution and a quiet farewell. Produced with the polish of Warner Brothers, it leaned toward pop and disco, stylish, rhythmic, but missing the raw pulse of New Orleans that had always defined him. Critics were kind but distant. The album failed commercially, and Toussaint, ever self-aware, withdrew gracefully. "Maybe," he admitted, "I've said what I needed to say for now." Behind that humility was exhaustion, not from failure, but from the weight of creation itself. He had given everything to music, to others, to his city. And when the applause grew softer, he didn't chase it. He simply stepped back. For most, the late 1970 years were a time of reinvention. But for Toussaint, it became a time of reflection. He watched as the artists he had guided found fame beyond measure, while he remained known mostly to musicians, critics, and those who cared enough to read the credits. The irony was gentle but profound. The man who had given the world rhythm now moved in silence. Still, his legacy refused to fade. Songs like "Working in the Coal Mine," "Yes We Can," and "Southern Nights" continued to be covered by new generations. Every version carried a little of his soul, even when his name was missing from the headlines. Inside Toussaint, when sessions ended and the lights dimmed, Toussaint often stayed behind. Sometimes he would play alone, slow, unhurried, letting the last notes linger in the air. It wasn't rehearsal, it was communion. In those quiet moments, you could sense the truth. He didn't need fame to feel fulfilled. The music was enough. It always had been. And yet, that stillness, that quiet grace marked the beginning of a new chapter. The golden years of New Orleans funk were fading, and so was the world that had celebrated him. Allen Toussaint had reached the top of the mountain, only to find peace, solitude, and the faint echo of applause drifting away. By 1980, the rhythm that Allen Toussaint had built was beginning to fade from the radio. The world that once danced to his grooves had moved on chasing new machines, new sounds, new faces. Disco, electronic pop, and the rising tide of corporate music left little room for the warm, human swing of New Orleans funk. The songs that once made jukeboxes come alive were being replaced by programmed beats. For Toussaint, it wasn't bitterness. It was silence, the kind of silence that comes after decades of sound. He never resented the changes. He simply understood that every rhythm has its season. Yet deep down, there was pain in watching the city's pulse being replaced by something colder. Toussaint's studio, once a sanctuary of creativity, began to quiet down. The meters pursued their own paths, labels cut budgets, and younger producers looked to Los Angeles for the next big trend. The same industry that had once begged for Toussaint's touch now seemed to have forgotten it. Still, he refused to chase relevance. "Music is not a race," he said softly in an interview. "It's a conversation. Sometimes you speak, sometimes you listen." That humility was both his strength and his tragedy. While others reinvented themselves for the charts, Toussaint continued to create music that reflected who he was, elegant, sincere, and never desperate for attention. But the times were changing faster than he could care to follow. His 1,980 releases came quietly, often without promotion. The records were good, sometimes beautiful, but the audience wasn't listening anymore. The new generation wanted flash, not feeling, volume, not grace. And yet, his phone never stopped ringing. When Elvis Costello sought him out for collaborations, when Joe Cocker needed arrangements with soul and depth, when Etta James wanted something honest, they all came to Toussaint. To musicians, he was still a godfather. To the public, he was a name they might have heard once, but couldn't quite place. The contradiction defined him: admired but unseen, influential but invisible. There were moments of doubt. Late nights when the piano stayed closed, when he wondered if the world still needed his kind of music. But then, he'd sit down again, press a few keys, and remember. The melody was still there, soft, patient, waiting to be heard. He kept performing around New Orleans, at small clubs and charity shows, always impeccably dressed, always kind. To those who met him, he was grace in human form, never complaining, never nostalgic, only grateful. But beneath that calm surface lay a quiet grief. The city that had once danced to his sound was changing too. New rhythms, new faces, new struggles. And as New Orleans evolved, Allen Toussaint began to retreat, as though giving space for the next generation to speak. He didn't fight the decline. He accepted it with dignity and silence, because to him, music wasn't about staying on top, it was about staying true. And in that truth, Allen Toussaint was unshakable even as the spotlight faded. The quiet years that followed were not wasted years. Allen Toussaint may have stepped out of the spotlight, but he never stopped creating. His home remained filled with melody stacks of handwritten sheet music, half-finished compositions, and the gentle hum of his piano drifting through the New Orleans heat. He played when he felt inspired, not because he had to, but because music was still the truest part of him. He began producing and arranging for artists who still believed in authenticity, Elvis Costello, Joe Cocker, and Aaron Neville among them. When they worked with him, they spoke of how he carried himself with quiet discipline, as if each note were a prayer. Toussaint wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was shaping legacy in real time, one chord at a time. In 1998, his contribution was finally acknowledged when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a non-performer. Standing at the podium, he spoke softly, thanking the city that had raised him and the people who had believed in him long before the world did. "Everything I am," he said, "is New Orleans." It was not a boast, it was a confession of love. For a brief moment, the spotlight returned. But Toussaint treated it the same way. He always had, gently, gratefully, never possessively. He went back to his home, his studio, and his piano. Then, in August 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck. The storm tore through New Orleans with unimaginable force, destroying homes, lives, and memories. When the levees broke, Toussaint's studio, his sanctuary, was swallowed by water. Decades of recordings, equipment, and instruments were lost. For Toussaint, it was like watching his life's work dissolve before his eyes. He evacuated to New York, unsure if he would ever return. For the first time, he was physically separated from the sound of his city. But instead of mourning, he turned loss into movement. He began performing more frequently, using his music to raise awareness and funds for recovery efforts. On stage, his fingers carried both sorrow and hope, the weight of what was lost, and the spirit of what could still be rebuilt. In 2005, he released The Bright Mississippi, a hauntingly beautiful album that reimagined early jazz through his graceful piano touch. It was not a comeback, it was a resurrection. Critics praised it as a master's reflection on time, tragedy, and resilience. As he played, the world began to see him again not as a relic of the past, but as proof of endurance. He was older, slower perhaps, but his presence carried the same quiet authority as ever. Even in the face of devastation, he remained a symbol of grace under pressure. For Toussaint, the consequences of decline were not bitterness or regret, they were renewal. Out of silence, he found purpose. Out of loss, he rediscovered love. And through it all, the city of New Orleans, battered, bleeding, but unbroken, still sang with him. Because for Allen Toussaint, the music had never been about surviving fame. It was about helping others survive life. When Allen Toussaint returned to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, he came home to a city both wounded and awake. The storm had stripped away facades, leaving only what was real, and in that stripped-down world, people remembered who had carried their sound through generations. They remembered him. He began performing again, not for applause, but for communion. His concerts felt less like shows and more like gatherings, quiet celebrations of endurance. Fans, old and new, filled the seats, some in tears, others smiling at the sight of him behind the piano once more. Each note he played felt like an act of rebuilding, each lyric a prayer for his city's soul. As he played, journalists began to rewrite his story. He was no longer described as a behind-the-scenes figure. Now, they called him what he had always been, the architect of New Orleans sound. The world was catching up to the truth musicians had always known. In 1998, his induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame had given him official recognition, but it was the years after Katrina that made him a legend to the living. He recorded new albums that felt like letters to history. The Bright Mississippi in 2005 was a quiet masterpiece, a journey through early jazz, blues, and spirituals filtered through the patience of age. Critics compared it to a conversation between Toussaint and his ancestors. Then came Songbook in 2009, a live recording that felt intimate, almost confessional. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was gratitude. Each performance carried a lifetime of memory, the weight of decades spent loving a city that sometimes forgot him, and the peace of knowing it never truly could. His collaborations expanded too. He worked closely with Elvis Costello, blending New Orleans soul with British lyricism. Together, they created music that felt timeless, witty, reflective, and rich with humanity. Younger artists, from Norah Jones to John Batiste, cited him as a mentor and inspiration. Toussaint had become what he never sought to be, a bridge between generations. Even beyond America, his influence rippled. British rock bands, Caribbean horn ensembles, and even Japanese jazz quartets traced their sound back to him. The chords he wrote in a small Gert Town home were now heard in distant corners of the world. But Toussaint never let the praise define him. He accepted honors with humility, often bowing slightly before sitting at his piano. "Music," he once said, "is not mine to own. It just visits me from time to time." In those final years, he seemed more like a philosopher than a performer, a man who had seen the full circle of art and ego, success and silence. What mattered now was not applause, but continuity. He wanted young musicians to remember that rhythm was more than sound, it was identity. To New Orleans, he was more than a musician. He was the heartbeat that refused to die. And to the world, he was proof that the quiet ones often leave the loudest echoes. In his later years, Allen Toussaint carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined his music. He was often seen walking through the French Quarter, dressed in crisp suits and soft colors, greeting people with a gentle nod. Strangers didn't always recognize him, but musicians did. For them, seeing Toussaint was like passing by a monument that still breathed. He continued to perform, his shows intimate and soulful, filled with laughter between songs. Audiences were drawn not only by his music but by his calm presence, that rare mix of wisdom and warmth. He often spoke of gratitude, not regret. "I've had a beautiful life," he would tell friends. Every note was a blessing. In November 2015, he was on tour in Europe, still sharing that blessing. After a concert in Madrid, surrounded by admiration and applause, Allen Toussaint passed away peacefully in his hotel room. He was 77. His death came quietly, just as he had lived, gentle, gracious, and without spectacle. The news traveled quickly. Across New Orleans, radio stations played his songs for days. Musicians, young and old, gathered in clubs and on street corners, playing his melodies the only way they knew how, by feel. Fans lit candles outside the ruins of Toussaint's studio, the building that had once given birth to the heartbeat of a city. The mourning felt less like loss and more like communion. The man was gone, but the rhythm remained. His funeral at the Orpheum Theater became a celebration of life. Dr. John, Elvis Costello, and Trombone Shorty played in his honor. The crowd stood and sang "Yes, We Can," a song Toussaint had written decades earlier, now transformed into a hymn of hope. Tears mixed with laughter, sorrow with gratitude. It was the most fitting farewell a city could give to the man who had given it its sound. In the years since, his influence has only deepened. Artists continue to rediscover his catalog, covering his songs with reverence. His melodies appear in films, documentaries, and concerts across the world. Universities teach his compositions as models of structure and soul. To many, Toussaint represents the ideal balance of intellect and emotion, proof that music can be both precise and deeply human. In 2022, the city of New Orleans dedicated a bronze statue in his honor near Lafayette Square. It depicts him seated at a piano, head slightly bowed, as if listening for the next note. Tourists stop to take photos, but locals often pause quietly, some placing flowers at its base. For them, it isn't just a monument. It's a reminder that greatness doesn't always arrive with noise. Even now, his sound lingers in the streets. In the shuffle of a brass band, the hum of a barroom piano, the laughter spilling out of late-night cafes. They called him the quiet genius, and perhaps that was true. But in truth, Allen Toussaint never needed to raise his voice. The music spoke for him, and all these years later, it still does. The night returns to New Orleans. The rain has slowed, and the streetlights shimmer across the wet pavement. Somewhere, faintly, a piano begins to play. It's soft, almost fragile, yet it carries the weight of a lifetime. That sound, familiar and eternal, is the spirit of Allen Toussaint still echoing through his city. His story was never about chasing fame. It was about honoring a gift, the ability to translate life into music. He spent decades writing melodies that reflected the rhythm of his people, proud, soulful, and unbreakable. Every song was a mirror of who he was, humble, graceful, and deeply human. Allen Toussaint taught us that greatness doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it lives quietly, between the pauses, in the space where truth and tenderness meet. He showed that music could be both brilliant and kind, and that humility is its own form of strength. From the church pews of Gert Town to the recording studios that shaped a generation, Toussaint's touch remains everywhere. Each brass line, each gospel harmony, each rolling piano phrase carries a trace of his soul. His legacy is not frozen in the past. It moves, it breathes, it keeps the city alive. And though he left this world far from home, his music never stopped traveling. It continues to guide, to comfort, to remind us that rhythm isn't just a sound, it's a way of life. So tonight, if you ever find yourself walking through the streets of New Orleans and hear a melody drifting through the night air, stop for a moment. Listen. That's Allen Toussaint, reminding us that even the quietest songs can last forever. Do you believe the music world ever gave him the recognition he truly deserved? Tell us in the comments below, and share your favorite memory, song, or moment that still makes you feel his presence. If this story touched you, take a second to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more journeys that honor the artists who shaped our world. Because their stories, like their songs, should never fade away. The last note fades, but the soul remains.